Greetings, everyone. Good evening. Kalisperas. It's been a week where people the world over have been paying tribute to the legendary composer and activist Mikis Theodorakis. We hope to be able to organise some events around his work, his life, and his music in the not too distant future. I hope you're all keeping well and safe during this lockdown. Hang in there. There is light at the end of the tunnel. Until we reach that end, we hope to keep you entertained, challenged, and engaged with our weekly Thursday seminars. And just a reminder to those following us on Facebook or YouTube, towards the end of the seminar, please feel free to submit any questions using the chat or comments functions. Before moving to tonight's topic, language, poetry, and a hot air balloon, Ioannis Vilaras and Ioannina in the time of Ali Pasha, allow me to thank Jeffrey Conahan, the sponsor of tonight's seminar. I encourage you all to become seminars of a seminar of your choice during the course of the year. The topic of tonight's presentation is on the enigmatic character of Ioannis or Ioannis Vilaras. He's probably unknown to most of you. The song you heard, Polaki Xeno by Haris Alexiou, has also been sung by other artists, but few are aware of the lyrics of the song, that the lyrics of the song are from Ioannis Vilaras. He certainly did live a colourful and eventful life. Vilaras was born on the island of Kythera, then part of the Venetian Republic, and later studied medicine in Padova, Italy. Medicine ran in the family, as Vilaras's father was a practicing doctor in the region of Ioannina during the time of Ali Pasha. In 1801, Ioannis Vilaras himself became the personal physician to Veli, the son of Ali Pasha. However, the mark Vilaras has left on Greek history is one of a lyricist, a poet, and a very strong advocate of the demotic language, the mutiki. And not just any demotic language, but an extremely simplified one to maximize its access to the masses and its acquisition. He favored an extreme and radical version of demotic Greek, or the people's language, based mainly on the phonetic orthography without using historic orthography or tones. Vilaras did not only limit his intellectual pursuits to the Greek language, he also developed one of the first Albanian alphabets, which was called the Vilaras script or Vilara alphabet. And who better to deliver this presentation than the well-known Dr. Alfred Vincent? It's great to have Alfred present at our seminar series again. It's a pity he can't be here in Melbourne in the flesh to deliver this seminar as originally planned. Alfred, welcome back again. Alfred is someone who has fought the good fight for Greek studies all his life that spans several decades. And we, the Greek community of Melbourne, would like to publicly commend him for his efforts. Unfortunately, not just Greek studies, but language studies and language education as a whole in Australia is quite marginalised. So we don't have need of sprinters, but marathoners in the quest to keep language learning on the map. Alfred has been one of those marathoners. After completing his tertiary studies, he spent 25 years in the Modern Greek Studies program at the University of Sydney and has taught courses as a visiting scholar at the University of Thessaloniki, Athens, and Crete. And despite having retired, he still finds the time to share his knowledge and wisdom whenever invited. Alfred, good evening.
Good evening, Nick.
The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Nick. Thank you for that introduction. It'll be a bit difficult to live up to all that, but anyway, I'll just do my best. Excuse me. So many people know that lovely song which we heard in the introduction, the Polaki Xeno, but not quite so many people know a lot about its origin and about the writer of the words on which it's based, who, as Nick said, is Ioannis Vilaras. And so he, as Nick said, is a very important character in his period, a very radical character in his treatment of the Greek language, in his proposals for the Greek language. And so we felt that it was worthwhile devoting a seminar to him. So here we go. Here he is. I'm not quite sure about the origin, the source of that particular picture. It's usually transmitted on the internet and so on without any source. We don't know who produced it. The picture of Vilaras is often confused with a contemporary of his, Christopoulos. But anyway, this is the nearest we've got actually to a genuine picture of Vilaras. So who was this man? As Nick said, he was born into a prosperous middle-class family based in Ioannina, northern Greece, where his father, Nikolaos, was a distinguished doctor. If anybody's not been ever to Ioannina, it is a fascinating place, actually, and I can thoroughly recommend it. There's actually some uncertainty about Ioannis's place of birth. When questioned by the police in Venice early in 1797, Vilaras did state that he had been born in Kythera, and for that reason, Wikipedia, for example, gives Kythera as his birthplace. But all other sources, including statements by Ioannis himself, give Ioannina as his place of origin. One possibility is that his family had moved temporarily to Kythera, returning soon after Ioannis's birth. Or perhaps he claimed to have been born in Kythera simply because that would have made him a Venetian subject, which may have been a useful thing to do at that particular moment in his life. As with many things connected with Vilaras's life, there's a lot of uncertainty. And if you see definite dates in a biography or definite places of the place of birth, don't necessarily trust it. Anyway, there are some things that we do know about Vilaras. In this little biography, I give his birth as 1770-71. It's not even the exact year is not quite certain, but anyway, that's roughly correct, one of those 2 years. He acquired a good basic education in his hometown, and Ioannina, in fact, was famous for its schools. It is now, of course, a seat of a university, a very distinguished university in Greece. The plan was for young Ioannis to study medicine in Italy and follow in his father's footsteps. For that purpose, he required Latin and Italian, which he was probably able to learn at home in Ioannina. At some point also, he acquired a knowledge of French. In 1793, or possibly a bit earlier, he left home to study at the famous University of Padova, near Venice, where numerous young Greeks had studied medicine or law over many centuries. There was no institution of a university type in the Greek lands under Ottoman rule, and so Greeks flocked to Italy, especially to Padova, but also to some other universities. Another famous Greek who studied at Padova a few years later than Vilaras was Ioannis Kapodistrias, who was to become the first Greek head of state. Roughly contemporary with Vilaras in Italy was Ioannis Koletis, also from Epirus, who was to become Greece's first prime minister, though Koletis actually studied medicine at the city of Pisa at the other side of Italy. During his studies in Italy, Vilaras spent a couple of years at another university in Bologna, another very famous university, somewhat to the south of Venice, before finally returning to Padova to take his degree. Now, young Ioannis had arrived in Italy at a time of great upheaval throughout Europe after the French Revolution of 1789. In 1796, when Vilaras was still a student, the French were at war with their archenemy, the Austrian Empire. An army led by Napoleon was heading a campaign in northern Italy, which was under Austrian occupation. And in June 1796, Napoleon's army actually occupied Bologna, where Vilaras had been studying. Padova, often called Padua in English, the university town, was part of the territory of Venice. I suppose it's about 30 kilometers west of Venice, and it had not yet been occupied by Napoleon. Now, Venice was a republic, not a monarchy, a republic, but it was an aristocratic republic. Power was in the hands of a small number of aristocratic families, and so it was very much part of the old regime. Many Venetians wanted to get rid of this fairly undemocratic republic in Venice. Many Venetians were in fact sympathetic to the Republican French. And during those years, 1795, 6, 7, espionage and conspiracies were rife. In every cafe in Venice, people were discussing for and against the French Revolution and what was going to happen in Venice itself. Early in 1797, the young Vilaras makes his first appearance in recorded history. He was staying in the city of Venice to attend to some financial affairs before returning to Padua to collect his degree. And he was a regular customer at one of these cafes, which was a meeting place for Greeks near the Greek church of St. George, San Giorgio de' Greci. On the 4th of February, he was interrogated by the police on suspicion of subversive activities. With other Greeks, he was suspected of espionage or propaganda for the French. Vilaras was reportedly a passionate supporter of the French Revolution. He was quoted as saying that anyone who does not accept French ideas is stupid and ignorant. The style is quite typical Vilaras, by the way. He tended to express his ideas in a fairly forceful sort of manner. Nonetheless, the authorities did not follow up the case against him, perhaps through lack of concrete evidence. And so in March of that year, he received his degree in medicine from the University of Padua. That's 1797. The following month, in April, the Austrians signed a treaty ceding much of northern Italy to the French. It included a secret clause giving Venice and its territories to Austria. But this did not result in a permanent settlement. Later in the year, 1797, Napoleon's army occupied Venetian territory and abolished the Venetian Republic. This event had an immediate impact on Greek lands, as the Ionian Islands had been under Venetian occupation for many centuries. Venetian overseas territories were now taken over by the French, and Napoleon sent a force to occupy the Ionian Islands. At some point after taking his degree, though we don't know exactly when, Vilaras returned to Ioannina, and he obtained a position as doctor attached to the court of the Ottoman provincial governor Ali Pasha. In particular, as Nick said, he was attached to Ali's son Veli. In this capacity, he accompanied Veli on military campaigns in various parts of the Balkans. From about 1807 to 1812, Vilaras was based on the Peloponnese, where Veli was governor. And then from 1812 to 1816, Vilaras was in Thessaly, again in the service of Veli Pasha. After this, he seems to have lived mainly in Ioannina. All this travel gave Vilaras opportunities to make contact with like-minded intellectuals, as well as to carry on research in botany and pharmacy. He was also able to carry on private medical practice, and he's said to have given free treatment to the needy. Meanwhile, Ali Pasha of Ioannina was building up something like an autonomous state. In 1820, he openly defied the Sultan's orders. The Sultan declared him a rebel and finally decided to get rid of him once and for all. To do so, he ordered Ottoman forces from the Peloponnese to attack Ali in Ioannina. And this, of course, gave the Greeks in the south the opportunity to begin the revolution. Finally, early in 1822, the Ottoman forces managed to gain control of all of Ioannina except for Ali's palace area. The Pasha started negotiations and was promised a pardon, but was killed anyway on the island in the lake. Vilaras and his family managed to escape during the attacks on Ioannina, and they settled in the village of Tsepelovo in the Zagori district, not all that far from the city. Their situation was extremely difficult, as their house in Ioannina had been destroyed and they had few possessions left. Nonetheless, the doctor continued to work for the Greek cause, and together with his friend, an important intellectual called Athanasios Psalidas, Vilaras was one of the main organizers of the coming uprising in Epirus. He collaborated with the leadership of the Philiki Eteria, the Friendly Society, the secret organization which had been planning for revolution in the Greek land since 1814. For a time, Vilaras was in charge of the funds which the revolutionaries were collecting in the Epirus region. He died in 1823, apparently as a result of hardships and stress. So, what kind of a person was Vilaras? One of the most informative sources on him is in the writings of Henry Holland, a young English doctor who travelled in Albania and Greece in 1812 and published a book of his travels a few years later. Henry Holland's book is actually available on the internet, and it's absolutely wonderful description of life in Greece and Albania at that time. Well, Henry Holland met Vilaras in Larissa in 1812. And Holland comments that we soon discovered the superior and masculine understanding of Vilaras, all whose remarks bore a character of deep and habitual thought and of extensive knowledge, rendered more impressive by a sort of stoical and contemptuous humour, which seemed the offspring of natural vivacity suppressed by circumstances, or of ambition disappointed by the events of life, end quote. This chimes in very well with the personality that comes out in Vilaras's satirical verses. A question that people must be asking is, what on earth was a democrat and a Greek patriot like Vilaras doing at the court of a tyrant like Ali Pasha? After all, Ali was the monster who tortured captives to death, who had 17 or 18 women drowned in the lake of Ioannina without trial on suspicion of adultery, and who committed countless other atrocities. Ali was indeed a cruel despot. He certainly could turn on the charm, especially for foreign visitors like Byron, but they did see through him. They usually realized that beneath this smooth exterior, there was great cruelty and an iron will and ambition. And yet, that is not the full story. Ali was, of course, an Albanian Muslim, not a Turk, an Albanian Muslim. He was born around 1740 in or near the town of Tepelen, hence his secondary name in Greek of Tepelenlis, or in Albanian Tepelena. He had little or no formal education, but he was highly intelligent and, of course, extremely ambitious. As well as Albanian, he could communicate quite successfully in Greek. Whether he knew any Turkish, I'm not sure, probably not very much at all. Ali began his career as a bandit and a local warlord, and later became an officer in Ottoman service. In 1787, he was made administrator of Trikala in Thessaly with the rank of Pasha. The following year, 1788, when the Pasha of Ioannina was away on a military campaign, Ali simply marched in with his men and took control of the city. His position was later confirmed by the Ottoman government as ruler of the province or Sanjak of Ioannina. This seems to have been the Ottoman government's habitual way of dealing with characters like Ali. He wasn't the only case. Somebody would seize power, would gain a certain amount of autonomy in their local area, and through lack of a better solution, the Sultan would confirm them in their position. Anyway, so now Ali had a legitimate basis for his power under Ottoman overlordship. He was able to have his son Veli made Pasha of the Peloponnese in 1806 and of Thessaly in 1812. And as we mentioned, Dr. Vilaras attended Vali in both of those places. Eventually, Ali acquired control over an enormous area, including quite a lot of mainland Greece and Albania. His aim, as we've said, was to create a fully autonomous state, and he got very close to achieving it. He carried on diplomatic relations with other countries as if he was, in fact, an independent ruler. He had relations, among others, with both Napoleonic France and with France's great enemy, Britain. Ioannina, in Ali's time, was a small but important city. This is what Vilaras's friend, Athanasios Psalidas, said about it. It has nearly 3,000 houses, of which 1,700 are Greek, 1,000 are Turkish, and up to 300 are Jewish. It has 5 fine governors' palaces, 7 churches, 17 mosques, and a small covered market, as well as schools in which more than 400 students study ancient Greek and Latin, poetics, rhetoric, geography, mathematics, philosophy, and theology. By referring to Greeks and Turks, Psalidas basically meant people of Greek Orthodox and of Muslim religion, respectively. The so-called Turks would have included many Albanian Muslims like Ali himself. Since many homes would have contained large families and servants, the total population was almost certainly, I would say, over 20,000. In 1812, actually, the English traveller Henry Holland estimated it at about 30,000, not including the Albanian soldiers in Ali's service. Since well before Ali's time, Ioannina had been an important commercial centre, and commerce was mostly in the hands of the Christians and the small Jewish community. The Greek merchants of the city had strong international connections. Many had emigrated and were engaged in long-distance trade in many parts of Europe. But emigrants would always retain their links with members of their extended family back home. In fact, Ali Pasha required that emigrants had to leave behind their property and at least one relative in Ioannina to act as a guarantee for their eventual return. In that way, the merchants of Ioannina created huge international networks. Henry Holland knew a family where of 4 brothers, he says, one was settled at Ioannina, another at Moscow, a third at Constantinople, and a fourth in some part of Germany, all connected together in their commercial concerns. Although Ali himself was an Albanian Muslim, he was not intolerant of other ethnicities and religions. He understood that he needed to keep the Greeks reasonably happy, reasonably on side, and he was prepared to do so, provided that they were loyal to him and paid their often oppressive taxes. And so he did have around him quite a large entourage of Greeks. One of the others, for example, for a time a doctor in his service was Ioannis Koletis, who, as we mentioned, was later to become Prime Minister of Greece. In Ali's relations with Greeks, he seems to have been strongly influenced by his Greek wife, Vasiliki Kitsu Kondaksi, the famous Kira Vasiliki, who we saw in a previous slide. Greek was the main written and spoken language in the districts that Ali controlled. His own language, Albanian, was not standardized and had no strong written tradition. So government business in Ali's domains was carried on in Greek with the aid of Greek-speaking secretaries. Ioannina, as we've mentioned, was an important centre of learning and culture, with a number of high-quality schools. The most famous of these was the Kaplanios Scholi, whose director was Vilaras' friend Athanasios Psalidas. Like Vilaras, he had studied abroad He studied both in southern Russia, what's actually now Ukraine, and also in Vienna, and he was an extremely learned gentleman. Like the doctor, Salidas became a passionate supporter of reform and modernization in education. He imported scientific instruments from abroad, up-to-date scientific instruments, so that he would be able to include modern courses in science in the curriculum of his school. Ali Pasha had no objection to that kind of innovation. On the contrary, it promoted his image of an enlightened ruler over a modernizing state. How enlightened he really was, well, not very clear. He was both a despot, but at the same time, he was trying to show this image of an enlightened ruler. Yes, in the final analysis, Ali Pasha was a despot, and he was a product of the Ottoman system, even when he fought against it. His administration was not conducive to the free circulation of political ideas. Vilaras found a clever way to get around this. In his book, I Romeiki Glossa, the Greek language, which he had printed in Kerkera, Corfu, in 1814, Vilaras included his own translations of some carefully chosen short passages of ancient Greek classics. One of these is taken from Plato's dialogue Kriton, which deals with issues of justice and the rule of law in a democracy. The other is Pericles' funeral speech on the Athenian war dead, one of the most famous passages in Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War. And it contains the following passage on the ancient Athenian system of government. It reads, "It is called a democracy because it is entrusted to the many, the demos, not to the few. It makes everyone equal before the law in their personal disputes. It awards public offices to those who show themselves most worthy. No privilege is given to high birth over merit. The poor person is not prevented by their lowly status from benefiting the city if they are able." By the way, passages such as these were not part of the regular school curriculum in Vilaras' period. Today, Ioannis Vilaras is mainly remembered as a poet, apart from being a linguistic reformer, and he started writing poetry at a very early age. Some of his poems are lyrical, like the Poulaki Xeno, which we heard at the beginning. A few of these have been set to music, and some can be found on YouTube. But many of Vilaras' poems are satirical in tone. He makes fun of everyone, from doctors like himself to monks. Disappointingly, he follows a fashion among male poets in his day of making fun of women, accusing womankind as a whole of vanity, coquettishness, and so on. I would like to think that these are early, immature works, and in fact, their language suggests precisely that. Vilaras left a lot of manuscripts of poetry and other work, and we don't quite know how much of this he actually intended to publish. It was mostly published after his death. One of Vilaras' most famous satires is his poem on the attempted launching of a hot air balloon. This apparently refers to an actual event which took place in either 1798 or 1803, according to different sources. It is said that the experiment was mandated by Ali Pasha himself. If that is correct, it would be an example of Ali's desire to give the impression of a modern ruler, interested in science and in keeping up with developments in Europe. The person in charge of the experiment was a certain Dr. Pachomis. It ended in disaster, though apparently no one was hurt. After Pachomis and his helpers had set up the balloon and lit the fire beneath it, a gust of wind blew it onto one side. Pachomis shouted frantic instructions, but they didn't understand. The balloon caught fire, and that was the end of the experiment. Now, Dr. Pachomis had studied in Italy like Vilaras. He came from what was then a rich mountain town, Syraco, 56 kilometers northeast of Ioannina. Like its neighbor Calarites, Syraco had an economy based originally on stock rearing, sheep and goats, in other words, and on woolen and other products, which were traded over a wide area. Merchants from Syraco and neighboring Calarites were established in Ioannina and also in Italian cities. Calarites and Syraco were bilingual towns, the main language being Aromanian or Vlach, Aromonica or Vlachica in Greek, which is of Latin origin like French and Italian and is similar to modern Romanian. Men involved in commerce obviously all learned Greek as well. Vlach, in any case, like Albanian, was a spoken language with almost no written tradition. Vilaras, whom we must admit was a little bit of a snob, makes fun of Pachomis and the villagers shouting and swearing in their own language. Dracul, they cry, the devil, and Damnadzeu, God. If time allows, we'll read a few lines of this poem at the end. Let's go back to our picture of Ioannis. Vilaras wrote a number of pieces for children. These include a set of modern Greek adaptations of Aesop's fables and a series of word puzzles and riddles. Also intended for children is a clever version of an ancient mock heroic poem, The Battle of Frogs and Mice, which was attributed to Homer but was actually written long after Homer's time. It makes fun of the genre of epic poetry, as in the Iliad, by making small animals take the place of the ancient heroes of Greece, the Battle of Frogs and Mice. As for his ideas on language and education, Vilaras developed these in some short prose pieces and also in long letters which he sent to various friends, such as Psalidas. These letters were apparently intended to be passed around a circle of like-minded people. Possibly he would have liked to see them published in the end. We don't really know. Vilaras, as everyone has gathered, was an accomplished linguist. Apart from Italian, Latin and French, he also had some knowledge of the Vlach or Aromanian language, as we saw in his poem on the hot air balloon. In addition, he learned Albanian, which would have been useful for communicating with the women in Ali Pasha's household and with other members of the court, as well as with soldiers and officials. Albanian at the time was almost exclusively a spoken language. There was in fact no standard way of putting it into writing. The Greek, Latin and Arabic alphabets were all occasionally used for Albanian, but none of these was really satisfactory. Vilaras actually devised an alphabet for it, which he used in letters and therefore must have taught to some other people. And using this alphabet, he compiled 86 pages of Albanian grammar notes with sample phrases and texts. This book, this manuscript, was eventually published in Greece in 1985. As for the Greek language, Vilaras, as we've said, was an ardent advocate for the use in writing of what he called the Romaic language, Romaiki glossa. This was a common way of referring to the spoken language, ordinary modern Greek, as opposed to Hellenic, Elliniki, the ancient language or an approximation to it, which was favoured by the upper church hierarchy and many of the intellectual establishment. Needless to say, ancient Greek had enormous cultural prestige, as indeed it still does. In the 18th century, it was preferred by some scholars of the Greek Enlightenment. Outstanding among them was this man, Eugenios Vilaras, who in other ways was a progressive thinker who brought to the Greek world some of the philosophical thought of the Western Enlightenment. Vilaras not only wrote textbooks in ancient Greek, but he actually used the language in his teaching. He believed that it was the only form of Greek suitable for expressing the concepts of higher learning. But under this system, students had to spend years learning ancient Greek before they could embark on advanced courses. Other learned Greeks at the time preferred to write in a language based on the spoken speech of Greece, but with some concessions to ancient Greek. A compromise of this kind became later to be known as katharevousa, the purifying language. It was, of course, the solution proposed by the great Adamantios Korais, and it was eventually adopted in various forms by the educational and cultural establishment in the new Greek state. At the same time, some 18th century Greek intellectuals held the more radical view that the spoken language was perfectly suitable to become the language of all intellectual life, all forms of writing, all forms of education. Moreover, they believed that it should be used as a means of making a good education more accessible to everyone. Vilaras' position was at the radical end of this spectrum. He completely rejected Korais' approach. He ridiculed the idea of purifying the language. He believed that the way forward was to adopt in writing a form of Greek very closely based on the spoken language. Any new technical terms necessary for modern life should be completely assimilated to the structures of spoken Greek. But the most radical part of Ioannis Vilaras' linguistic philosophy are his proposals for spelling reform. He presented these in a small book titled Iromaiki Glossa, printed in Corfu, Kerkyra, in 1814. He proposes a system which would represent in writing the sounds of the Greek language in the simplest possible way. His system is strictly phonetic. That is, one sound is represented as far as possible by a single letter. One or two sounds, like the sound b and d, had to be represented by two letters, but otherwise it was always one for one, a one-for-one correspondence between sound and letter. So whereas in the standard system, then as now, the sound E can be written in 6 different ways, as epsilon iota, eta iota, omicron iota, epsilon or epsilon iota. In Vilaras' system, it's always written as eta. That's why we can see in the title page of his book, I Romeiki Glossa, it's got 2 etas in, or the last one would have been an eta anyway in the spelling. At the bottom, we've got Stin typografia ton corfon. Typografia would have been written, and is written in modern spelling, with the T with epsilon and Fia with iota. So this is a very radical change of the spelling. And there are others too. You can see that he's abolished the letter omega. Glossa is written with an omicron, and he's abolished double consonant. So glossa has only one sigma, only one S. Excuse me. In Greek of the classical period, those letters, those 6 letters and combinations, all written, all used to represent nowadays the sound E, in ancient times, they all represented different sounds. They've all come together over the centuries and come to be all pronounced as E. In learning to write modern Greek, as I'm sure many people listening to this seminar know, the problem is to know which letter or combination is correct in any given word. With Vilaras' system, all the complex rules and exceptions of Greek orthography are abolished. All you would have to know would be the simple list of correspondences between letter and sound. Reading and writing could be taught very easily by the method which we now call phonics. I think you would be able to learn to read and write correctly in his system simply in a day or two, perhaps in a few hours. You just had to learn the 23 letters of his alphabet and which sounds correspond to them. For Vilaras, language reform and educational modernization were directly linked with his democratic ideals. We saw how he got this across in the Romaiki Glossa by choosing extracts from Plato and Thucydides that deal with the relation of a citizen to a democratic state. Vilaras' spelling reform looks very radical, and indeed it was. It did not get the positive reception that he hoped for, and indeed, towards the very end of his life, he seems to have moderated his ideas to some extent. So why this refusal to adopt what might seem to be a logical reform? Well, part of the answer, much of the answer, really lies in the enormous prestige of ancient Greek. Even in modern times, there has been a reluctance to adopt reforms which would make modern Greek in writing look less like the ancient language. Now, conservatism in a written language is not just a Greek phenomenon. Look at English. Our spelling is extremely complicated, and kids spend years trying to get on top of it. Teachers are still debating how to teach it. I'm sure everybody's read about the debate about phonics and the whole language approach and so on, or some mixture of the two. Proposals for the simplification of English have existed since the 16th century and have made little headway, apart from a few superficial changes adopted in the United States of America. And all that despite the fact that English does not have the prestigious ancient ancestor that Greek has. Writing systems are very often profoundly linked to a nation's cultural identity. Obvious cases are Chinese and Japanese, whose writing is far more complicated than either English or Greek. Ironically, Vilaras' proposal is true to the most ancient principles of Greek alphabetic writing, because in origin the Greek alphabet was purely phonetic. Each of the letters or combinations which now represent the sound I originally stood for a different sound or combination of sounds, as we've said. There were no complex spelling rules to learn. Despite all that, I doubt whether anything like Vilaras' reform will ever be adopted for Greek, and I'm not sure that it should be. The fact that modern Greek is descended from the ancient language, as Vilaras recognized, is an important part of the collective self-image of Greeks today, and this heritage is preserved in the writing system. Vilaras' proposals have always been considered too radical, though reforms have gone some way in the same direction. During his lifetime, the only thing Vilaras published in print was his Romaiki Glossa. Most of his other works remained in manuscript, scattered in various places. In 1827, 4 years after his death, a collection of his poems and some prose works was published in Kerkyra. Since then, there have been various reprints and new editions, but amazingly, there is no complete authoritative edition of his poetry and prose work. His botanical works and works on pharmacy have never been published and appear to have been lost, which is tragic because he was considered one of the most important botanists of his period, and botany at the time was closely related to medicine. People wanted to know what the properties of plants were, how they could be used. So what was Vilaras' legacy? On the surface, it may seem rather small. But actually, Vilaras contributed to a movement for linguistic and educational reform that started well before his time and continued long after. It was no coincidence that his works were published in Kerkyra, one of the Ionian Islands, which was still under Western rule. The influence of the Constantinople-based elites was far less strong in Kerkyra and the Ionian Islands than it was in Athens. A tradition of demotic writing existed in the Ionian Islands long before Vilaras and continued throughout the 19th century. Dionysios Solomos, originally from Zakynthos, later settled in Kerkyra, he followed Vilaras in using the dialogue form to convey his ideas about the language of the people and to satirize those who opposed it. The final stages in the progress of demotic were its official recognition after the fall of the junta in 1974. and the adoption of the simplified accent system, the monotonico, in the 1980s. Vilaras played a valuable part in this long struggle for linguistic democracy. If he was alive today, I think he would be disappointed that language reform has not gone further. Life would be much easier for children if he had, but I think he would understand something of the psychological pull of the traditional spelling system, and he would be pleased at least that the old system has been simplified to some extent, and above all, that the language of the people, the demotic language, in a somewhat modified form, has become the national language of Greece. Before we end, I'd like to read one of Vilaras's very short poems, which seems especially relevant to the times we live in. Its topic is what he calls prolipses, literally prejudices, though its meaning can be extended to all the irrational ideas which can take over our mind and even threaten our very existence. I'll read it first in a very rough English translation, for which I apologize, and then I'll read it in Greek. Oh, false, fake, fixed ideas, you tyrants of the soul, people hold you in awe and pay a bitter toll. When prejudice enthroned starts to pontificate, the senses become numb and logic has no weight. O prolipses tu cosmu, tyranny tis psychis, o cosmos sas latrevun, janane distichis. Afou apud o throno I prolipsi milai, I estises necronum, o logos nephelai. Thank you. Ευχαριστώ.
Thank you, Alfred, for that sort of wonderful presentation. You've definitely put Ioannis Vilaras on the map. I might kickstart things off with a few questions. No doubt the system he was proposing was monotonico, gotten rid of all the other diacritics, perispomenes, Dionysios, and that type of stuff. But my question, with respect to the omega and the omicron, in Greek, you sort of need them to differentiate sort of nouns from verbs. That's one reason. How did he sort of justify that simplification process? Would it be context that would give away the verb? Because there is a reason for the two to exist. And what was the justification? That we won't be confused, the context will give it away? Or
yes, the context, after all, when speaking, can you tell now when I say, I don't know, chorus, can you tell from the mere sound which of those two is omega or omicron? I would suggest that you can't. In the spoken language, in the sounds of the language, omega and omicron represent exactly the same sound. And so it is the endings and the context which make it clear always whether what you've got is a verb or a noun, or what kind of noun, or whatever part of speech. After all, as I say, there is no difference between omega and omicron in speech, just as there is no difference between eta and iota and epsilon and omicron iota and all the rest. So in speech, it's perfectly clear. And so it is in Vilaras's writing system, though admittedly, it does take a little while to get used to it. When I say a little while, I mean probably a few minutes or an hour at the most, and then you're used to it. Okay. The same with double consonants, the double consonant in glossa, the word for language. In standard modern Greek, there are no double consonants. Of course, there are some dialects, Cypriot in particular, which do preserve some double consonants, but I'm talking now about standard mainland Greek, of which
Okay.
which
And
sort
just another question. In his writings, is there any talk about his relationship or his relations with the Jewish community of Ioannina? Because, as we know, it's a very old community. It's
yeah,
a Romaniote community, not a
Romaniot, yes.
yeah. And what language would they have been speaking at the time? It definitely wouldn't have been Ladino. Were they speaking Hebrew, or they were just speaking Ottoman Turkish or Greek? Or
As you said, Nick, the Jews of Ioannina, who were probably over 1,000 of them in Vilaras' time, they were Romaniot Jews, Romaniotes, Evrei, descendants of families who had been living in the Greek areas for many, many centuries, probably from the early centuries of our era. And so their prime language was Greek. It wasn't Ladino or Judeo-Spanish. Judeo-Spanish was the language of the Jews from Spain who had been thrown out of Spain after 1492, and many of them, of course, settled in Thessaloniki. They were a huge component of the population of Thessaloniki up to the Second World War, when most of the Jews of Greece, the vast majority, became victims of the Holocaust. So they spoke as their first language this Spanish dialect known as Judesmo or Judeo-Spanish, which was also spoken by Jews in Constantinople and in Balkan cities such as Sarajevo and in Monastiri, which is now Bitola in North Macedonia, and so on. But the Jews of Greece, as I say, were a Romaniot Jewish community. They used Hebrew, of course, in their services. I think they also used a bit of Greek in some synagogue services. And they certainly used some Hebrew loanwords in their own dialect of Greek. There's a lot of writing that you can read of them, and of course, read about them. And of course, they're the subject of a very famous short story by Dimitris Chadzis, Sabethai Kambilis, about a historical person who, like most of the rest of the Jews of Ioannina, was murdered in the Holocaust.
okay, thanks for that. We've got a question from Petrikan. Was Vilaras' botany work known to other botanists of the period, like Joseph Banks? Are there any references to any of his work by other botanists?
He was known in Greece among his own circle of intellectuals. He was friends with many doctors, especially in the places where he went along with Ali Pasha as doctor. And so he had this wide circle of acquaintances, and they certainly knew and respected his work. He was a bit of a guru among them, I would say. But the thing is, he didn't publish any of this stuff. Now, no doubt he wanted to, but he died rather young at the age of about 52 during the War of Independence. So it's all rather sad, really. It looks as if his botanical work was lost, though you never know. It's a funny thing in Greece and in Greek studies that new manuscripts, new sources of information do keep turning up. Like just a few years ago, a copy of the first edition of Eratokritos turned up in Kozani. So we needn't totally give up hope, but certainly they don't seem to be known. They would have been known to travelers, especially the travelers who met him. Obviously, Henry Holland, a doctor, would have been interested in botany and was aware of Vilaras's interest. But the problem is that he didn't get into print.
Okay. Got a question here from our friend Christos Fifis. Thank you, Alfred, for your lecture. Did Vilaras follow his rule in his poems? I noticed Pulaki ke felai with epsilon iota, or that's just been changed into modern Greek.
Yes, to make it easier for people to read on the PowerPoint, I simply transcribed that particular poem into ordinary modern Greek spelling. So yes, Poulaki in the original would end with a eta. Philai ends with alpha eta, and he also used the old Byzantine abbreviation for U. So U in his writing is not two letters, but one. It's a letter which looks like a bit like a, well, I'll trace it into the air so people can see it's a letter which looks a bit like this. That's how he writes an U sound instead of OU.
Looks like you've given yourself away. You're not a disciple of Vilaras, Alfred, but not to worry. We won't hold it against you.
Look, Nick, I am a disciple of Vilaras. I'm an enormous admirer of Vilaras. I'm an enormous admirer of his linguistic ability, because to do what he did, he had to make an analysis of the sounds of the language. And he actually understood some things about the language which other people in his day did not understand. I'm an enormous admirer of Vilaras. I'm just not sure whether this loss, if you like, of the visual heritage of the Greek language is worth the sacrifice for the sake of this very much simplified form of writing. And as I observed, so many languages have the same sort of issue, difficult spelling and difficult writing systems, without the excuse of having this very ancient and glorious heritage of Greek. So I'm just not sure. I'm not sure. I might change my mind next year. And in 50 years from now, the attitude of the Greek people may be very different. People may decide that for the sake of a simple and democratic education system, it may be worthwhile to make these changes. I don't see that happening very quickly, but whole attitudes can change over decades.
It's a slippery slope. Then the next stage would be to use the Latin script. But anyway,
unfortunately or fortunately, that has been proposed. It's a very unpopular idea at the moment. But the Cretan texts which I studied, including the comedy, which I edited and studied for my PhD thesis, are actually written in manuscript in Latin script, in a writing system based on Italian. But that's another story.
One thing that also impressed me sort of in your story today, Vilaras, that he attempted to create an Albanian script.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Okay. Now, did later on the script that became the standard Albanian language, did it borrow a lot of the ideas from Vilaras? Did he take on some?
I've actually brought that up onto my PowerPoint. I don't know whether people can still see the PowerPoint, but you can actually find it anyway on the internet. It's called the Vilaras alphabet. In Wikipedia, they actually spell Vilaras's name Vellara. It's called the Vilaras alphabet. Can people see that? So that's Vilaras's Albanian alphabet, and below the letters there's a modern Albanian version. Many different proposals were made for Albanian. As I say, at least 3 alphabets were used for it: Arabic, Greek, and Latin. Eventually, at the end of the 19th and early 20th century, Albanian scholars decided that the simplest and best solution was an alphabet based closely on the Latin, the Western alphabet, in other words, but with certain special letters or combinations to cater for the individual sounds of Albanian. Now, Vilaras alphabet took a different tack. As you can see, its letters don't look like anything familiar except for just 1 or 2, like the letter O. He was clearly trying to create something which would be neutral, which would not link the Albanians with either the Greeks or the Turks and Arabs or with Western Europeans. I don't know why he did this. He may have discuss it in his notes. Unfortunately, we've not got the book which he wrote about Albania. We've not got it in Sydney. But he seems to have been aiming at something which would have been acceptable to all Albanians and wouldn't give any particular group a sort of advantage or disadvantage. Everybody had to learn this almost from scratch. Now, I don't know Albanian, and so I can't really judge just how effective this is as a writing system. Just looking at it as you are on the screen, some of the letters look rather similar to each other, and that can lead to confusion. But anyway, as I say, he did try it out. He used it in a few letters, but it was never widely adopted for Albanian.
I've got a question here from Mary Vilaras. Thank you for such an interesting and enjoyable presentation. I enjoyed the historical and social context. What would Vilaras want his legacy to be? What did he see as his main achievements?
That is a wonderful question. Yes, I like that. I believe he would have thought his main concern was for education and language reform, which, as we said, were closely entwined. He would have been disappointed that his reforms were not adopted in full, but as I say, he would have been consoled by the fact that eventually in Greek, the demotic language was adopted as a national language and some simplifications were made. So perhaps that would have been some qualification. I think he thought that was more important than his poems. His poetry was sort of occasional poetry, if you know what I mean. A lot of it is lyrical love songs, quite beautiful, some of them, like Pulaki Xeno, which we heard. Other poems are satire, but he never tried a sort of lyrical, heroic poem of the kind which we find in Solomos, you know, the Hymn to Liberty and so on. Nonetheless, in some ways, Solomos can be seen as a successor of Vilaras, following on to some extent in the legacy of Vilaras. Shall I answer, Mr. George?
Yeah, let me just read out the question for the rest of the audience because I probably can't see it. Where is the piece of Eratokritos that ended up in Kozani? I wonder if Dr. Vincent knows.
Yes. Excuse me. It is in the Municipal Library of Kozani. And I think it was last year or the year before, it was actually on show. It's probably still on show in a special case of its own. Now, what it is, Eratokritos was written probably around 1600, but first printed, as far as anybody knows, in 1713. There's very few copies. I think only one or two copies of this first edition of Eratokritos have survived. The rest were probably read to death, loved to death, you might say. But this copy, which seems a good copy, in good condition, was preserved as a family heirloom in a family in Kozani, or the Kozani district. And a few years ago, it's presented to the local library. It spent several years, it was in conservation, that is to say, various kinds of repairs to, you know, prevent it deteriorating and so on. And then it was placed actually on show in the library.
Okay.
So when we can visit Greece again, we can actually go and see it there. Let's hope that will be soon.
Okay, I think we have to probably bring it almost quarter past proceedings to a close. At the beginning of this seminar, we did hear Pulaki Xeno by Haris Alexio. If you want to hear a more hardcore version, I think Yoros Papasideris has also sung that song. I sort of slightly prefer that one, but we probably use a more popular one. Alfred, thanks once again. And keep well, keep safe, and we hope to see you again in Melbourne in the not too distant future.
Well, thank you all for the invitation and for all the technical assistance. And Wonderful work that you're doing with the seminars. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. Good night, everyone.